Some women are born with power. Others are forced to awaken it. But what happens when the most dangerous woman in town is the one no one notices? The one standing quietly behind the grocery counter, folding laundry in the dark, or waiting alone at a parent-teacher meeting. This isn't a story about superheroes or soldiers. It's about a simple woman. One who watched. One who waited. One who never forgot. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? And as this story unfolds, ask yourself, how far would you go to protect your child? The yellow bus slowed to a stop in front of the looming iron gates of Westfield Academy, hissing as its doors opened with a tired breath. Aaliyah Mitchell stepped down, clutching the frayed strap of her old backpack. Her sneakers, worn but clean, met the glossy marble tiles of the front walkway like an intrusion. A ripple of silence moved through the morning air as students turned to stare. Some looked curious. Others looked confused. A few simply smirked. In a sea of pale polo shirts, name-brand handbags, and polished shoes, Aaliyah didn't just stand out, she didn't belong. Westfield Academy was more than just a school. It was a monument. Generations of power had walked its halls, carved their names into its walls, and paved a golden path for their children to follow. The ivy on the stone buildings wasn't just decorative, it was a symbol of tradition, of wealth, of a quiet, suffocating exclusivity. Here, connections mattered more than character. Heritage trumped effort, and Aaliyah Mitchell, a scholarship girl from the south side of town, represented everything the system had spent years trying to keep out. Still, she walked on, past the whispers, past the glances, past the mural that honored Westfield's legacy of excellence, a mural where no one looked like her. She reached into her pocket and gripped the small silver pendant around her neck. It had belonged to her grandmother, a woman who had once marched in the rain for the right to sit at the front of a bus. "You're stronger than they want you to believe," her grandmother had said once, holding her hand tight. "And don't you ever let their silence tell you different." Her fingers curled around that memory as she stepped into the main building. The floors gleamed under the morning sun, a slick surface of wealth and cold indifference. She moved past glass trophy cases filled with gold-plated victories, names she didn't recognize, faces frozen in pride. A woman at the front desk didn't bother to look up as she pointed Aaliyah toward the principal's office. Principal Calloway was a thin man with a face made of corners and an expression sharpened by decades of discipline. He looked at Aaliyah like one might examine a stain on a white shirt, regretfully with resignation. "Miss Mitchell," he said, not offering a smile, "I trust you'll keep up with our standards here. Westfield is not an easy place for outsiders." "I'll do my best, sir," Aaliyah replied, her voice calm but steady. "See that you do." She left his office with a slip of paper and a schedule in her hand. She didn't even see the group of students outside until she bumped into one of them by accident. "Watch it," a boy snapped. The voice stopped her. Mocking, sharp, entitled. She looked up into a face that was startlingly symmetrical, like a statue sculpted from arrogance. Logan Hastings. She knew the name before it was spoken. Son of the mayor. Future of Westfield. The prince of the playground. "So," he said, scanning her top to bottom, "you're the scholarship girl. I didn't know this school had a charity program." His friends snickered behind him, Brock Chambers, Ethan Kleen, Trey Warren. A circle of privilege and power, all dressed in wealth disguised as school uniforms. Aaliyah said nothing. She looked directly into Logan's eyes, not with anger, not with fear, but with stillness. Her silence unsettled him more than any comeback could have. And then she walked past them, her footsteps echoing like the first drumbeat in a song that no one had prepared for. The rest of the day passed like a slow-motion fall. Every class brought new stares, new snickers, new exclusions. Teachers called on her like they were checking a box. Students sat around her like she was contagious. At lunch, she found a quiet corner in the cafeteria and opened the lunchbox her mother had packed that morning. Simple rice, steamed vegetables, a boiled egg cut in half. Humble food for a humble child. Logan arrived 5 minutes later. He leaned on her table like it belonged to him. "What's that?" he sneered. "The peasant special?" Laughter erupted from the group behind him. "I hear the filet mignon's pretty good today," Brock added. Aaliyah didn't flinch, didn't blink, just took a bite of her food slowly. That, of course, was unacceptable. Logan swiped the lunchbox off the table. It hit the floor with a soft thud and spilled like a secret. The cafeteria fell silent. She stared at the mess on the floor. Then she looked up slowly, not at the food, at him, right in the eyes. Her voice was still calm when she spoke. "Pick it up," A collective gasp. Logan's face twitched. What did you say? I said, she repeated, rising from her chair, pick it up. He stepped forward, as if to remind her who he was. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the stillness in her face. The way she didn't blink. The way her voice didn't rise. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the whisper of another presence, a force he couldn't see but felt. Because what Logan Hastings didn't know was that Aaliyah wasn't alone. Across town, in a dimly lit laundry room that doubled as a kitchen, Julia Mitchell was watching. She leaned over a faded laptop with surveillance footage playing in grainy black and white. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but she wiped it away quickly. She had cried enough years ago, when she buried her badge, her past, and the truth. The world knew her as a nurse. A tired, quiet woman who walked to work and came home without a sound. But before she disappeared, Julia Mitchell had been one of the most feared internal investigators in Washington. They called her the Watcher. Not because she acted quickly, but because when she did, the world fell apart. She hadn't wanted to return. She hadn't wanted this life for Aaliyah. But Hastings had made it personal, and she knew how to dismantle people like him. Piece by piece. You've just met Aaliyah and caught a glimpse of Julia. What would you do if your child was under attack by a system built to erase them? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and stay with us, because this story is just beginning. The morning after her first encounter with Logan Hastings felt colder than usual, even though the sun shone bright through the dusty blinds of their small apartment. Aaliyah stood in front of the mirror, brushing her hair in silence. There were no bruises, no marks, but something inside her had shifted. She hadn't cried the night before. Not when Logan slapped her lunch to the floor, not when his laughter echoed in her chest long after he left the cafeteria, and not even when she got home and saw her mother asleep on the couch still in her scrubs. But now, as she looked at her own reflection, she realized silence could bruise too. And the worst part was, no one had helped her. She arrived at school early that day, hoping to avoid the crowds, hoping to walk the halls before the sneers and the whispers began again. But hope, at Westfield, was a dangerous thing. When she reached her locker, she stopped in her tracks. The word charity case had been spray-painted in red across the door, dripping like blood. Below it, a crudely drawn crown, Logan's trademark signature. His way of marking territory. Aaliyah stood there frozen. A group of students passed behind her, but no one said a word. Some glanced, some smirked, others turned their heads. Even the hall monitor, a teacher's assistant, looked and kept walking. That was the true power of the Hastings name. It didn't need to shout. It whispered, and the world obeyed. She reached out, placed her fingers on the cold metal, and wiped a bit of the red paint with her thumb. It smeared across her skin. The silence around her felt heavier than before, like standing in a room full of people all pretending you don't exist. And that was the cruelest tactic of all. Not the insults, but the indifference. From a distance, Zoe Wilson watched. Zoe, the janitor's daughter, understood the unspoken rules of Westfield. She knew how invisibility worked. Her father had cleaned the floors of that school for nearly 20 years, yet no one remembered his name. And Zoe? She was only tolerated because she never spoke up, never stepped out of line. But watching Aaliyah now, standing still as shame dripped from her locker, something inside her stirred. Courage was contagious, after all. Later, in math class, Aaliyah sat down to find her textbook missing. In its place was a note. Maybe you should try learning numbers at the local gas station where you'll end up working. She folded the note and tucked it into her pocket without reacting. That was what they wanted, tears, outrage, a crack in the armor. But she gave them nothing. Instead, she opened her notebook and tried to copy the equations from the board. But even that became a challenge when her calculator went missing. Her pencils snapped in half inside her bag, and her eraser had been soaked in glue. Logan didn't need to be present. His influence was an organism that slithered through every hallway, every locker, every classroom. And the worst part was, everyone let it happen. At lunch, she didn't even bother going to the cafeteria. She sat beneath the old elm tree near the maintenance shed, unpacking her food on the grass. Zoe found her there and sat beside her without asking. "Why don't you report it?" Zoe asked quietly. "I did," Aaliyah replied. "They said it was probably just a prank." Zoe bit her lip. "It's not going to stop, you know. Logan doesn't just bully. He hunts." "I know," Aaliyah whispered. "But I'm not prey." Zoe looked at her, surprised by the strength in her voice. There was no anger, no vengeance, just calm determination. It unsettled her. Most people broke. Most people cried in bathrooms or transferred schools. But Aaliyah wasn't flinching. In another part of town, Julia Mitchell sat in a public library in front of an ancient desktop computer. The internet at home had been shut off after a late bill. She wore glasses with thin lenses, her hair tucked beneath a faded scarf, fingers moving quickly across the keyboard as she logged into a secure server she hadn't touched in years. It had taken her only 12 hours to trace the IP address from the threats sent to her daughter's school email. It was amateur work, clearly done by a teenager. But that didn't mean it wasn't dangerous. She downloaded footage from the school's security cameras. As expected, half were mysteriously disabled during the incidents. But she knew how to find blind spots. Years ago, she'd been trained to map out surveillance networks, how to find what others wanted hidden. Westfield was a fortress, but every fortress has a crack. Julia was patient. She knew what it took to break down systems, not bombs or bullets, but exposure. She printed stills from the footage and laid them across the table, Logan laughing as he walked past Aaliyah's defaced locker. Ethan switching textbooks in a classroom. Brock slipping something into a gym bag. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Later that evening, Aaliyah came home and found the apartment empty. Her mother had left a note. Shift ran late. Eat something. Love you always. Beside it, a small container of soup and a slice of bread. Aaliyah sat down, pulled out the note from her locker, and stared at it, only to find the gas valve disconnected. When she turned to ask for help, Mrs. Harrington marched over with a frown. Miss Mitchell, this is the third disruption this week. I didn't. No excuses. I'm docking your grade. And with that, her final project, worth 30% of her mark, was gone. Her GPA, already hanging by a thread under the weight of hostility, dropped further. By lunchtime, her mind was spinning. Every hallway, every locker, every whisper felt rigged against her. She couldn't prove anything. That was the brilliance of it. Logan Hastings didn't need to touch her to hurt her. He merely pulled invisible strings, and the world responded like a puppet. When she entered the cafeteria, her usual spot under the elm tree was already occupied by another group. She had no choice but to walk in and face it. As she stepped into the dining hall, silence rippled like a tide. She carried her tray slowly, head high. When she finally sat down at the far end of the room, Logan rose from his table as if on cue. He walked toward her, trailed by Brock and Trey, wearing the kind of smile wolves wear just before the kill. Well, Logan said, sitting across from her without asking, how's your week been? She didn't answer. She took a bite of her apple and stared back at him. He leaned in, voice lowering. You're not fitting in very well, are you? Aaliyah said nothing. You know, there's an easier way through all this, Logan continued. His tone casual, almost kind. If you play along, keep quiet, accept your place. Still silence. He tilted his head. Or, you keep pretending you're something special, and let the whole school crush you slowly. Your choice. She looked him in the eyes. You mistake my silence for weakness. That's your first mistake. Logan's smile faltered for just a second. Then he stood. Suit yourself. By the end of the day, her locker had been emptied. Books shredded, her sketchpad torn to pieces, and a small envelope left behind. Inside, a note written in block letters, leave before it gets worse. That night, when Aaliyah got home, Julia was waiting at the table, dinner untouched. Her laptop was open, the screen glowing dimly with maps, names, and redacted documents. She didn't greet her daughter with questions or sympathy. She simply said, tell me everything. Aaliyah hesitated, unsure whether to break the wall she had built around herself, the wall of I'm okay and nothing's wrong. But then she saw the look in her mother's eyes, not panic but readiness. A calmness honed by someone who had survived storms far darker. They're not just bullying me, Aaliyah finally said. They're trying to erase me. And so she told her. Everything. Julia listened without interruption, her fingers steepled under her chin, absorbing every word. When Aaliyah finished, her mother leaned back and closed the laptop. Tomorrow, Julia said, you're staying home. Aaliyah blinked. What? I can't. You can. Because I need time. Time to handle this my way. But, I promise, Julia said, you'll walk back in there with more power than they've ever seen. The next morning, Aaliyah stayed home, but she didn't sleep in. She sat by the window, watching the street below, wondering what her mother was doing. Julia, meanwhile, was across town walking through the front doors of Westfield Academy, not as a parent, but as a woman who had once interrogated cabinet-level officials. She wore no makeup, carried no briefcase, and offered no smiles. Just a folder. and a stare that had made corrupt men sweat in underground hearings. She asked to speak with Principal Calloway. He met her in his office with the kind of patience people reserve for janitors or customer service complaints. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand you have concerns." She sat down across from him and placed the folder gently on the table. "You're going to read this," she said, "and when you're done, you're going to call a mandatory staff meeting." Calloway raised a brow. "Excuse me?" "I know what's happening here," she said. "I know about the blind spots in your camera system, the sudden grade changes, and the manipulation of student files. I know that the Hastings family has donated more to this school than all the other families combined, and I know how often Logan's infractions have mysteriously disappeared from your records." He laughed once, awkwardly. "You're making serious accusations." She opened the folder. Inside were photos, screenshots, email chains, a spreadsheet of campaign donations linked to school contracts, and a signed complaint from a former teacher, anonymous but damning. "Still think they're just accusations?" Calloway's face lost its color. His mouth opened, then closed. "I'm not asking you to fix this," Julia continued. "I'm telling you what will happen next. If any student touches my daughter again, if her grades mysteriously drop, or if she is ever harassed on these grounds once more, I will release this entire file to every media outlet in the state. And I'll make sure the Department of Education comes knocking on your door within the week." Calloway swallowed hard. "This is blackmail." "No," Julia said calmly. "This is accountability. You just haven't seen it in a while." She stood, smoothed her coat, and added, "You have until Monday." When she walked out of the office, the silence behind her was deeper than anything Logan Hastings had ever commanded. That night, as Aaliyah prepared for bed, her mother handed her a small slip of paper. "What's this?" Aaliyah asked. "Your new schedule," Julia replied. "They've reinstated your gym class, adjusted your chemistry grade, and assigned a staff member to monitor harassment complaints." Aaliyah looked up, stunned. Julia gave a small smile. "You said they were trying to erase you. I just reminded them that some names don't disappear easily." Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the branches against the window. And in his room across town, Logan sat on the edge of his bed staring at his phone, reading a short, anonymous message that had just appeared. "The simple woman you mocked isn't so simple after all. Be careful what you try to bury. Some things don't stay buried." His fingers tightened around the phone. For the first time in his life, Logan Hastings felt something unfamiliar. He felt hunted. The halls of Westfield Academy looked the same, but something had shifted. The silence Aaliyah walked through that morning was no longer full of judgmental whispers. It was cautious, uncertain, like the eye of a storm. People glanced at her, but looked away just as quickly. No one laughed when she passed. No one blocked her locker. Even the regular jeers from Logan's friends were absent. It was as if the whole school had inhaled and was holding its breath. But Aaliyah had learned better than to feel safe. This wasn't peace. It was a regrouping. She walked into her first class and noticed it immediately. The seating chart had changed. She'd been moved to the back, near the supply closet, separated from her few allies. On her desk was a sticky note in unfamiliar handwriting. "Don't get comfortable. Nothing's over." She peeled the note off without a word and tucked it into her folder. Meanwhile, Julia Mitchell sat across from an old friend at a coffee shop downtown. He was a retired federal systems analyst named Marcus, someone Julia had worked with during a quiet operation years ago, back when her badge still opened doors instead of drawing suspicion. "You've got 5 minutes," he said, sipping his coffee. "What are we doing, Jules?" "I need access to sealed municipal data," she said without prelude. "Westfield City Council votes, educational funding ledgers, campaign donation records from the last 5 years. Marcus raised a brow. "You're not going after Hastings, are you?" "I'm not going after anyone," she said. "I'm making room for the truth." He sighed, set his cup down, and studied her. "You're digging up ghosts." Julia didn't blink. "Some ghosts deserve resurrection." He slid a flash drive across the table. "Encrypted. Temporary access. 3 days max." She took it, nodding once. 3 days is all I need." By the time she returned home, Aaliyah was already there, face flushed, pacing the small living room. "They're pushing again," Aaliyah said, no longer trying to hide her anger. "They won't touch me directly, but they're working through teachers. They changed my seat, tried to isolate me. And today in the library, someone deleted my research paper from the system." Julia didn't flinch. She simply motioned for Aaliyah to sit beside her on the couch, opening her laptop and connecting the flash drive. Good, she said. Aaliyah frowned. Good. They're getting predictable. Lines of data streamed across the screen. Julia's eyes scanned quickly, trained from years of sorting through deception. Her fingers moved across the keyboard like a pianist playing a grim melody. Within minutes, she found what she needed. There, she murmured. What is it? Financial irregularities in school spending. And look at this, 37% of the district's discretionary funds have gone toward facility beautification projects. Guess who owns the construction company? Aaliyah leaned in. Let me guess. Brock Chambers' father. Julia smiled, cold and deliberate. Bingo. And these contracts? Signed off with fast-tracked approvals by Thomas Hastings himself. Aaliyah sat back slowly. It's all connected. It always is, Julia said. Corruption doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's systemic, woven in. But here's the thing about networks. Pull the right thread, and the whole thing unravels. That night, while Aaliyah studied, Julia drafted an anonymous report. She compiled the documents into a single file. School budget discrepancies, campaign donations, board meeting attendance logs that showed intentional absences before key votes. Then, using an old contact list she still had memorized, she sent it off to 3 local journalists, 2 state auditors, and 1 parent coalition. By morning it had begun. Local news ran a quiet headline, Whispers of Corruption, Westfield's funding secrets under review. It wasn't explosive yet, but it was enough to start the ripple. At school, teachers were more alert, their tone guarded. The principal wore a tight-lipped expression and left meetings with his phone glued to his ear. Logan noticed too. He stormed into the boys' locker room after gym and slammed his bag against the wall. Brock and Trey exchanged nervous glances. What's your problem? Brock asked. Someone's leaking, Logan said, eyes burning. And I think I know who. He didn't say her name, but they knew. Later that day, Aaliyah found her locker untouched. No graffiti. No missing books. But that only made her more anxious. Then, during her elective photography class, the attack came from a new angle. Mr. Levin, the teacher, handed out graded portfolios. Aaliyah's was marked with a red C-. She blinked at it. Sir, I submitted. Mr. Levin didn't even look up. Your submission was incomplete. That's impossible. I triple-checked it. You can file a complaint if you want, he said with a shrug. But I have no record of receiving the full file. She stared at him, the sudden rush of helplessness rising like a tide. He wasn't malicious, just complicit. Afraid. Easier to go along than to resist. That was the real power Logan held. Not in direct violence, but in eroding truth through fear and silence. Aaliyah clenched her jaw and walked out of the classroom. That evening, when Julia returned from work, she found her daughter pacing again, fists tight. They erased my work, Aaliyah said. Again. Julia put her bag down. Then we adapt. I'm tired of adapting, Aaliyah snapped. I'm tired of surviving. I want to fight back. Julia nodded slowly. Then she walked to the bookshelf, pulled out a dusty leather journal, and handed it to her daughter. What's this? Everything, Julia said. My old notes. Case files. Techniques. How to document patterns. How to build undeniable proof. It's how I took down a pharmaceutical exec in D.C. It's how I cracked a judge running a bribery ring. And now it's how you are going to dismantle Logan Hastings. Aaliyah opened the journal and saw the diagrams, the flowcharts, the questions. How did you learn all this? She asked. I spent 10 years listening to liars, Julia said. And 15 learning how to make them tell the truth. There was a pause between them. Then something clicked in Aaliyah's eyes. A new resolve. A new edge. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was preparing. That night, Aaliyah made her first chart. She listed every teacher who had graded her unfairly, every accidental system failure, every misplaced file and schedule change. She cross-referenced dates, rooms, student witnesses. Then she started recording. Phone camera tucked in her pocket, microphone disguised in her jacket. No more relying on memory. No more he said, she said. From this point forward, everything would have a record. And Julia? She reached deeper. She accessed a secure server, one no longer listed on public databases, and found something buried. A surveillance contract between Westfield's district and a private tech firm run by none other than the uncle of Ethan Clean. She made another file. Another report. By dawn, the pieces had begun to fall into place. At school the next day, Aaliyah wore a small pendant camera hidden in the loop of her necklace. When Logan passed her in the hallway and whispered, "Smile while you still can," she smiled back and captured the moment. When Mr. Levin forgot her project submission a second time, she asked to record their conversation for clarity. He refused. She still hit record. They weren't ready for a girl who documented everything. And no one suspected her mother was the one building the blueprint behind the scenes. Across town, Logan's father was on a phone call, voice rising. "Find out who's leaking this. I don't care how. Find them and shut it down." But the truth was out, and the storm had only just begun. The storm finally came, not with thunder, but with headlines. On a cold Thursday morning, the town of Westfield woke up to news alerts flashing across local media sites. Exclusive: audit suggests misuse of public funds in Westfield School District. Beneath the bold title was a familiar name, Mayor Thomas Hastings. His photo, usually seen beaming at ribbon cuttings and press conferences, was now framed in suspicion. The report linked his office to unauthorized budget allocations, shady construction contracts, and unaccounted-for campaign donations that conveniently looped back to Westfield Academy. The town buzzed with murmurs and speculation. Aaliyah sat at the kitchen table that morning, stunned. Julia, sipping coffee across from her, didn't look surprised. "You knew this would happen," Aaliyah whispered. Julia didn't answer immediately. She stared at the steam curling up from her mug, then said, "Truth has momentum. All it needs is the first push." At school, the energy had changed again. Students huddled in groups, phones in hand, scrolling, whispering. Teachers walked the halls with stiff posture and nervous eyes. Principal Calloway appeared twice in the same hallway in under an hour, unusual for a man who rarely left his office. And in the center of it all, Logan Hastings was nowhere to be found. Aaliyah noticed it immediately. No smug comments. No looming presence in the cafeteria. His seat in homeroom sat empty like a throne without its king. She was halfway through literature class when her phone buzzed inside her bag. Discreetly, she glanced at the screen. One new message from an unknown number. "You've made a very dangerous enemy." She stared at the words for a long moment, then deleted the message and refocused on the lesson. But her stomach churned. She knew Logan wasn't the type to disappear quietly. He was recalculating. Retreat, in his world, didn't mean surrender, it meant strategy. By late afternoon, Logan returned to school. He walked through the front doors with his usual entourage behind him, but there was no cocky grin this time. No jokes. No loud laughter. His jaw was tight, eyes hard. He looked at Aaliyah once during the last period of the day. Just a glance, but it was enough. There was something cold in his stare. Something sharpened. Aaliyah didn't look away. She knew exactly what she was up against now, not just a school bully, but a boy raised on entitlement, shaped by a man who believed power meant immunity. After class, Zoe caught up to her. "Did you see the article?" Zoe whispered, wide-eyed. "People are talking. Your mom really did it, didn't she?" Aaliyah hesitated. She didn't do it alone. That night, Julia worked late into the evening. Files spread across the table, redacted documents opened on the screen. Every piece of the Hastings empire had a paper trail. It was just a matter of tracing the right ones. She was no longer operating in the shadows. If they wanted a war, she would fight it in the open. But even the best strategists know that pressure cuts both ways. Just after midnight, Julia's phone rang. The voice on the other end was familiar, Marcus, her old colleague. "They're moving faster than we expected," he said. "I just got word from an internal source. Hastings is pulling strings to discredit your name. There's a rumor they're going to accuse you of hacking school servers and leaking private information." Julia's jaw tightened. "Let them try." "No," Marcus said. "They're serious. They have the connections to make this stick if you don't act fast." Julia exhaled slowly. "Then we push harder." The next day, Aaliyah arrived at school to find a notice taped to the front entrance. Due to an ongoing investigation, student devices will be subject to random checks by administration. The notice was clearly aimed at her. She tucked her pendant camera inside her hoodie and walked through the doors without hesitation. They could check her phone. They wouldn't find anything. The real files were stored elsewhere, on encrypted drives Julia had hidden years ago for cases much more dangerous than this one. Inside the school, Logan waited. When Aaliyah walked past him in the hallway, he stepped in front of her. "You think you've won something?" he hissed. "No," she said calmly. "Not yet." He leaned closer. "You don't belong here. People like you never last." Aaliyah tilted her head slightly. "That's funny. I could say the same about you." His lips curled in a twisted smirk. Watch your back." Then he walked away. She stood still for a moment, letting the weight of the threat settle. But the fear that once would have shaken her now felt distant. She wasn't the girl who entered Westfield alone anymore. She had her mother. She had Zoe. And she had the truth. During last period, Principal Calloway called her to his office. "Miss Mitchell," he said, folding his hands on the desk. "It's come to our attention that certain students have been documenting incidents on campus without permission. We're concerned about privacy violations." Aaliyah didn't blink. "You mean evidence of bullying?" "I mean content that may have been selectively edited." She leaned forward. "Are you accusing me of something, sir?" Calloway hesitated. "We're simply reminding you that students are expected to follow the code of conduct." Aaliyah pulled a sheet of paper from her folder. "This is a list of every violation I've experienced since the start of the term. Dates, times, names, most of which I reported, most of which were ignored." Calloway's face darkened. "If you'd like," she added, "I can file a formal complaint with the State Education Board." There was a long pause. "Have a good day, Miss Mitchell," he said quietly. As she left his office, Aaliyah felt something new rise inside her, not just defiance, but confidence. A sense that for the first time, she was no longer playing defense. When she got home that night, Julia was waiting with new documents spread across the table. "This," Julia said, pointing to a spreadsheet, "is the real reason Westfield protects the Hastings family." The file showed connections between Hastings and multiple regional board members, people who approved funding, admissions, scholarships, all of them tied together through political contributions and social favors. "It's a web," Julia said, "and Westfield is just the center." Aaliyah stared at the file. "If we pull it all down," Julia nodded, "we don't just change your school. We change the entire town." Aaliyah took a deep breath. "Then let's do it." The next morning, Zoe handed her a USB drive. "My dad found something in the maintenance logs," she whispered. "Turns out security cameras in the east hallway were edited last week. Guess who was in that hallway just before your paper went missing?" Aaliyah's eyes lit up. "We got him." By Friday afternoon, Aaliyah and Julia had compiled everything: footage, logs, testimony, and files. Julia made one final move, sending the entire package to a national investigative news program that specialized in educational corruption. Then they waited. And when the segment aired 3 nights later, all of Westfield watched as the truth unraveled on live television. Photos of Hastings, campaign scandals, construction fraud, and most damning of all, footage of Logan's harassment spliced with teacher inaction. It was no longer just a whisper. It was a roar. The town exploded with outrage. And the Hastings name, once a symbol of invincibility, had become a synonym for disgrace. But Julia knew it wasn't over yet. Because people like Thomas Hastings don't go down quietly. And Logan? He still had one move left to play. They just didn't know yet how far he was willing to go. The air was heavy with tension the morning after the national expose aired. The gates of Westfield Academy, once symbols of grandeur and elitism, now felt more like the crumbling walls of a besieged fortress. Security guards stood at the entrances not to protect students, but to manage the growing number of parents, reporters, and protesters gathering outside with signs that read justice for all students and end the Hastings monopoly. Inside, Principal Calloway moved like a shadow, silent, erratic, panicked. Every door he passed through closed quickly behind him. Every word he spoke sounded rehearsed. Whispers followed him. Some teachers pretended to focus on their lessons while subtly checking their phones. Others wore a new expression, one of guilt. Aaliyah sat in history class watching it all unfold. No one called her names. No one snickered. There were no whispers when she walked in, and no shoves in the hallway. Instead, there was a strange silence, respect tinged with fear. It wasn't admiration. Not yet. But something had changed. Zoe leaned in and whispered, "They're talking about you like you're some kind of vigilante." Aaliyah didn't smile. "It's not about being feared," she said. "It's about being seen." By lunch, the cafeteria had become a battlefield of power realignment. Students who once worshipped Logan now sat uneasily, avoiding his gaze. The boys who used to laugh the loudest at his cruelty were suddenly quiet, unsure which direction the wind was blowing. Logan, however, wasn't backing down. He sat alone at the far corner of the cafeteria, his jaw clenched, eyes dark with calculation. His phone buzzed every few minutes, texts from his father, calls from PR consultants, lawyers. His world was falling apart, and he blamed one person. That afternoon, as Aaliyah walked to her locker, she noticed something out of place. Her lock was slightly tilted, the dial resting oddly off-center. Her stomach twisted. She opened it cautiously. Nothing seemed disturbed until she looked closer. Taped to the inside of her locker door was a single Polaroid photo. It was taken from behind, a shot of her and her mother walking home, heads down, shadows stretching long behind them. On the back, in jagged handwriting, "You exposed us. Now we expose you." She didn't flinch. She folded the photo, slipped it into her backpack, and went straight to the library. Zoe was already waiting. "We need to talk," Aaliyah said, placing the photo down on the table. Zoe stared at it. "Is this a threat?" "No," Aaliyah said. "It's a warning. He's not going to play through the school anymore. He's going personal." Julia arrived home later that evening to find her daughter calm but serious, sitting at the table with the photo already laid out beside her laptop. Julia's face didn't show fear, only recognition. "I was wondering when he'd make it personal," she said quietly, slipping off her coat. "What do we do?" Aaliyah asked. Julia stared at the photo. "We let him make his move." Aaliyah frowned. "You're okay with him watching us?" Julia shook her head. "I'm not okay with it, but I'm ready for it. And now so are you." That night, Julia activated something she had kept hidden for over a decade, a small, discreet surveillance grid in their neighborhood, installed during her federal days when she was investigating domestic corruption rings. She had never taken it down, and now with one keystroke, she brought it back online. Within hours, motion-triggered video files began feeding into her screen. It didn't take long to find him. Logan, cloaked in a hoodie, had been following them. The footage showed him lurking near the alley behind their apartment, watching their front door, circling the block. He wasn't just angry, he was spiraling. Julia compiled the clips into a timeline and encrypted it under a new file. Phase 2, Personal Retaliation Evidence. "Let him play," she murmured to herself. "Let him show who he really is." Meanwhile, in the Hastings estate, Logan was unraveling. His father's political allies were disappearing. Financial backers were pulling out. The construction company owned by Brock's father had been frozen pending federal investigation. And worst of all, Logan was being watched by students, by teachers, by the media. He no longer ruled Westfield. He merely haunted it. Thomas Hastings, his once confident voice now cracking under pressure, barked instructions from his study. "You fix this," he shouted. "You fix this now." Logan paced, his mind racing. "She's making me look like the villain." "You're the villain," Thomas snapped. "That's not the problem. The problem is people finally believe it." Logan slammed his fist into the wall. "Then maybe it's time she gets a taste of fear." Thomas looked up slowly, his expression dangerous. "Be careful what you say, son. I can protect you from lawsuits. I can't protect you from jail." But Logan was already pulling on his jacket. "I'll scare her. That's all. No one's going to get hurt." Back at the Mitchell apartment, Julia prepared for what she knew was coming. She moved Aaliyah's desk away from the window, double-locked the doors, and kept a small tracking app open on her phone. She told Aaliyah to study, but Aaliyah knew better. Tonight was different. Sure enough, at 2:13 a.m., movement triggered Julia's alert. She opened the live feed. There he was. Logan, standing across the street, staring up at their window. He wasn't holding a phone. He wasn't taking photos. He was just standing there, still like a statue with eyes full of fire. Julia didn't move. She let him stand. Let him look. Let him imagine. Then, just as he turned to leave, floodlights from a car parked 2 houses down lit up the street. Marcus stepped out of the vehicle, flanked by 2 plainclothes officers. "Logan Hastings," Marcus called calmly, holding up a badge. "We'd like to have a word." Logan froze. The officers moved in. But Julia had instructed them beforehand. No handcuffs, no formal arrest, just enough pressure to let him know. "We see you now." The next morning, news spread that Logan Hastings had been questioned by investigators. No charges. No headlines. But the rumors moved faster than facts ever could. And in a place like Westfield, reputation was everything. At school, Logan returned, but the fear was gone. His power had drained. He walked through halls no longer held in awe, but in suspicion. Teachers who once ignored his behavior now watched him closely. Students whispered when he passed, not in admiration, but in disbelief. Zoe leaned toward Aaliyah and grinned. He's just another name now. But Aaliyah knew better. Power didn't just disappear. It regrouped. She kept recording. Kept documenting. Because when people like Logan Hastings fall, they always try to pull someone down with them. And the game wasn't over yet. It was the week before midterms, and Westfield Academy had transformed into a place no one quite recognized anymore. The marble floors still gleamed, the banners still hung in pristine order, but the atmosphere had cracked. The silence that once accompanied Aaliyah Mitchell through the halls was gone, replaced by stares filled with equal parts curiosity and awe. Students who never looked her way now whispered her name as she passed. Not with malice, but with respect, though fragile and not yet trusted. The principal, once the face of silent complicity, had become a ghost. James Calloway, now moved with the twitchy nervousness of a man who knew the structure around him was on the brink of collapse. He attended every class briefing, sat in on staff meetings with legal observers, and avoided any eye contact with Aaliyah. He was a man waiting for the other shoe to drop, and the sound of it was already echoing down the hallway. The day's classes passed slowly. Aaliyah took notes, turned in assignments, and walked through each period like a chess master planning her next 20 moves. But beneath her composure, she could feel it, something shifting, something approaching. At lunch, Zoe hurried to her table in the courtyard, her face pale. "I heard Logan's been planning something," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. Aaliyah didn't look up. "He's always planning something." "No, I mean something big. I overheard Brock talking to Ethan in the locker room. They're scared. Not for Logan. Of Logan." Aaliyah raised her eyes. Zoe leaned in, voice barely above a breath. "They said he's unhinged. That he's going to do something no one can walk away from. They don't know what, but they're done helping him." Aaliyah nodded once, folded her hands, and stared out across the courtyard. The trees had begun to bloom early. A strange, beautiful contrast to the tension building in the school. It reminded her that life moved forward, even while chaos gathered like smoke. Later that evening, Julia sat in the living room with her laptop open, a cup of black coffee untouched beside her. She had received a call that morning, anonymous, no caller ID, no voice. Just a soft breath, and then a click. It wasn't the first. But this one was different. It came exactly 30 minutes after Aaliyah turned in her latest report on Logan's harassment, including camera footage, digital logs, and a teacher's reluctant written testimony. Julia stared at the blinking cursor on her screen, then closed the laptop gently. "Mom!" Aaliyah called from her bedroom. Julia answered without turning. "Come here for a second." Aaliyah entered the room, her expression calm but alert. She had learned to read her mother's energy like weather. Tonight, something was brewing. "He's preparing something," Julia said. "We both know it. And he's running out of time." Aaliyah sat down beside her. "So are we." Julia looked at her daughter. "Are you ready for this to get worse before it gets better?" "I've been ready since the first time he pushed my tray onto the floor." Julia allowed herself a small smile, but her eyes didn't lose their edge. "Then we make the final move. Tomorrow we go public, completely. No more anonymous leaks. No more indirect channels. We take our case directly to the school board. You'll speak. I'll provide documentation. Let's bring this into the light." The next morning arrived with a gray sky and scattered drizzle. Aaliyah and Julia stood outside the Westfield Education Center as concerned parents, students, and board members trickled in. A community meeting had been scheduled, formally to discuss student well-being, but everyone knew the subtext. It was about power, it was about control, and it was about Logan Hastings. Inside the building, the tension was unbearable. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table where the school board members sat, some feigning neutrality, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Principal Calloway stood near the exit, arms crossed tightly. Aaliyah approached the podium slowly when her name was called. The murmuring in the room settled. She stood straight, her voice steady. "My name is Aaliyah Mitchell. I'm a scholarship student at Westfield Academy. I came here to learn, to work hard, to earn a future. But instead, I walked into a system built to silence people like me." The room was still. "I was bullied, targeted, humiliated, on campus, in class, in front of teachers who said nothing. And I wasn't the only one. Others were too afraid to speak. I'm not anymore." She paused, then pulled a small USB drive from her pocket and held it up. "This contains video footage, emails, attendance logs, altered grades, and surveillance showing harassment carried out by Logan Hastings and others acting under his influence. It also shows administrative neglect, deliberate, documented, and continuous." Gasps echoed across the room. Aaliyah turned to the board. "You have the power to ignore this, to bury it, or you can act. You can choose justice over tradition. Choose truth over comfort." She stepped back. Then Julia rose from her seat, and handed a folder to each board member. Everything she just said is backed by evidence, Julia said. Reviewed, time-stamped, and verified by independent observers. I'm a former federal investigator, and I say this not as a professional, but as a mother. If you do nothing today, then you're telling every student in this district that silence matters more than justice. The board sat in silence, the weight of their own complicity choking the room. Then something unexpected happened. One board member, Mrs. Elena Rhodes, who had previously stayed silent in every past hearing, stood. I move that we place Logan Hastings on immediate suspension pending a full investigation. Another voice joined. Then another. The motion passed. Outside, as Julia and Aaliyah stepped into the cool air, reporters swarmed with questions. Julia shielded her daughter with her arm, but Aaliyah paused. We're not heroes, she said to one microphone. We're just people who stopped pretending not to see. That night, Logan didn't go home. He disappeared. His phone went unanswered. His social media accounts were wiped clean. And though Thomas Hastings denied any knowledge, his absence sparked even more questions. The following morning, Westfield Academy held its first full school assembly addressing student equity, safety, and reform. Policies were rewritten. Staff reassigned. But none of that mattered to Aaliyah as much as the shift she saw in the students around her. They stood straighter. They spoke louder. They saw each other differently now. At the end of the week, Aaliyah found a letter in her locker. It was unsigned. Inside was a simple line. You didn't just survive Westfield. You changed it. And she knew in that moment that something lasting had begun. But deep down, she also knew that Logan wasn't finished. No, not yet. He was wounded, cornered, humiliated, but not gone. And boys raised on power never disappear quietly. It was 3 days after the board meeting, and the sky over Westfield had cleared, but the tension that hung over the town hadn't lifted. Rumors moved like wind, quiet, fast, and impossible to trace. Some said Logan Hastings had left the state. Others whispered he was hiding in one of his father's private properties up north. The truth, however, was far more unsettling. He hadn't left. He hadn't run. He was waiting. Aaliyah walked the school halls that morning with cautious confidence. Students nodded when they passed her, some even offering soft smiles or brief acknowledgments. Teachers now treated her with the professionalism they should have always extended, respect rooted in quiet apology. The administration had implemented immediate oversight procedures. An external investigation into grade tampering and systemic bullying had begun. For the first time in months, Aaliyah allowed herself to breathe. But not fully, because something felt unfinished. Her instincts had been sharpened by the past months of quiet warfare, and they whispered to her now, something's off. She couldn't explain it, not with evidence or words, only a low, creeping certainty that Logan Hastings had one more move left. She told Julia that night over dinner. They sat together in their small kitchen, the table littered with case notes and leftover spaghetti. He's not done, Aaliyah said, her fork paused midair. Julia looked up from her laptop. You feel it too. I don't know if it's fear or memory, but it's there. Like we're waiting for a door to slam, and we don't know where it is. Julia didn't dismiss it. She never did. We tightened the perimeter. No risks. No walking home alone. And I'll speak to Marcus about increasing the monitoring. Aaliyah nodded, but it wasn't enough. He's going to try something public. Loud. To reclaim what he lost. The next day passed quietly. Too quietly. Then came Friday. It began with a blackout. At exactly 8:07 a.m., the school's power flickered once, then cut completely. The emergency lights kicked in. Classes paused. Phones buzzed with confused messages. Technical maintenance, said the principal over the backup PA system. Nothing to be concerned about. Please remain calm. But Aaliyah's heart began to race. Zoe found her in the hallway near the science lab. I don't like this, she said, eyes wide. This isn't a power outage. It's coordinated. Brock's missing. Trey's not in class. And someone said Logan's name is back on the attendance roster. Aaliyah felt her pulse in her ears. Where? They don't know. But he's here. Julia, at that exact moment, was receiving a call she'd been dreading. It was Marcus. Julia. One of our surveillance points was tripped. An hour ago. Downtown utility box, sabotaged. The person who did it knew the system. Julia stood up from her desk, already grabbing her coat. Logan. Or someone working for him. I'm heading to the school. Stay on the line. Inside Westfield Academy, chaos began to simmer. Lockers were found open. The principal's office had been vandalized, spray paint across the wall. You wanted war. Aaliyah and Zoe made their way toward the library, thinking it might be safer than the halls. They didn't make it. As they turned the corner past the trophy case, Logan appeared. He was alone. No entourage. No mask of arrogance. Just fury, pure, raw, and hollowed out. Zoe instinctively stepped in front of Aaliyah, but Aaliyah pushed gently past her. Logan, she said, voice firm, unwavering. This isn't going to change anything. It already has, he said quietly. You ruined everything. I told the truth. You made me look weak. No, Logan. You did that to yourself. He stepped closer. Aaliyah didn't flinch. What are you going to do? She asked. Logan opened his jacket, revealing a flash drive on a lanyard. You think you're the only one with files? I have records too. On your mother. On her past. On the things she buried. Aaliyah narrowed her eyes. Go ahead. Release them. That caught him off guard. What? Release them, she said again. Let the world see everything. Because you know what happens when people see the truth? They act. That's what you never understood. Fear isn't control. It's just delay. You built your world on delay. And I burned it down with one spark. He stepped back, slightly shaken. I have nothing left to lose, Aaliyah said. But you still think this town owes you something. Before Logan could respond, a voice rang out behind him. That's enough. Julia stood there, flanked by 2 officers and Marcus. Her eyes locked on Logan's. Drop the drive, she said. And step away from my daughter. Logan turned slowly, calculating. You think they'll believe you over me? He asked. I don't need them to believe, Julia replied. I have footage of you disabling the school's main circuit, damaging public property, threatening students. You walked into a trap, Logan. And this time, there's no one left to protect you. Logan looked around. The walls that once shielded him were gone. The board had turned. The town had turned. Even his friends had turned. He dropped the flash drive. The officers moved in. As they cuffed him, he turned to Aaliyah one last time. You're not a hero, he said. No, she replied. But I'm free. Can you say the same? The rest moved quickly. Logan was escorted off school grounds. The media swarmed. Julia submitted all final files to the authorities. The investigation widened, now including Logan's attempted blackmail and cybercrimes. His father's legal team issued a statement, but it rang hollow. And just like that, the Hastings legacy collapsed. In the weeks that followed, Westfield transformed again. Policies were overhauled. Staff were retrained. Students found their voices. And Aaliyah? She walked the halls not as a girl fighting for breath, but as a young woman who had earned her place with grit and truth. One afternoon, during a town forum, she was invited to speak. She stood behind the microphone, not with fear, but with clarity. I didn't ask to be a symbol, she began. But if my story helps another student believe they don't have to be silent, then I'll carry it proudly. Applause erupted. Julia, standing in the crowd, smiled quietly. That night, as the 2 sat under the stars on their apartment balcony, Aaliyah turned to her mother. It's over, she said softly. Julia looked out over the city lights. The worst of it, yes. But the fight for justice is never really over. It just changes shape. Aaliyah rested her head on her mother's shoulder. Then let's keep watching. Julia nodded, her eyes scanning the horizon. Because sometimes the most powerful people in the room aren't the ones speaking the loudest. They're the ones who see everything and never stop.